BCRC, Dr. Doris, Technical Vision Leadership, and Tayu, and everyone else involved, and all of you for coming today. And so I'm just gonna give an overview, because I know not everyone here has been previous BCRC meetings, or BCRT or BSEC for that matter, and so I want to make sure that folks know the BSEC side of things. And we're going to very well with BCRC. That's another thoughts on local solutions, and then we're gonna get today. The agendas are on the table. Every table has an agenda or two, but here it is again. And so, yeah, our job, I think, this opening session is finish on time. We're very small regions, so we gotta do that. And yeah, it'll be good. Good conversation. So, for those who are not familiar with BSEC, maybe don't know that's some part of it. Who is BSEC? So BSEC is BCRC, it's the Department of Public Works, it's the Office of Sustainability of the city, it's our partners with the state, it's partners at various neighborhood groups across the city, from Addiction Park Heights Farm, from all kinds of organizations. It's a bunch of universities, so I'm in Hopkins, we've got Morgan State, partners, UMBC, Penn State, several Baltimore field station, a bunch of people working together, and we're all trying to work towards this problem of making Baltimore an equitable climate resilient city. Both what are we, so we are co-generating the science that we need for solutions. That's our mission statement, right? We're co-generating knowledge, drawing and channeling the wisdom of you, channeling the experience, channeling some of the strengths of our research institutions to really understand the way forward. And by the end of it, we hope to have some pathways, some potential pathways, right? We're not here to like give the answers. We're here to chart out possible options that we collectively as a city can come together and feel good about, right? As a reminder, there's good conflicts on it, right? There's a lot of different interest groups, there are a lot of different people trying to make the person who might have to voice all that, and come up with something that people can gather around, not that everyone's gonna say, there, that's the answer, but this is a pattern we might be supporting. So this all started about 2 years back, a little less than 2 years ago, a bunch of folks were here gathered together, where in East Baltimore, and did a kickoff where we started talking about, okay, what should BSEC focus on? What are the primary areas we want to think about? And these answers, which you've seen in other, I think this is a group that does a lot of climate stuff and environment stuff in Baltimore. These aren't just problems, right? These are the priorities that identified and said, okay, we're going to organize ourselves around these 4 basic themes. And the heat and flooding are pretty self-explanatory. I'll talk a little bit about heat now, and then today we're going to focus on flooding. The other two, air pollution, just want to emphasize that something the community is well aware of, right? The indoor air quality and some of the housing involved, and we're really concerned. So we're trying to take that on. And then decarbonization, that's one that comes from various angles, right? You can call it different things. You can call it the city's net zero promise, right? You can call it greenhouse gases. Basically what it is if we're going to get to net zero the way that we want to and that the world needs us to, how do we do that in a way that advances equity and that alleviates energy poverty, and we don't get into some situation where rates go up, people suffer, right? So that's something that I think is important to stay on. Okay, so here's, I promise I'm a little on charts, even though that's my job. But here's, I'll try to play it. So here's how this works, right? On the left hand side, right, we deliver, we all get together, days like today, right? And we talk about what are our goals, what are we trying to achieve here? And also what might be the challenge we're facing. On the right hand side, meanwhile, we like work together to implement this environmental measurement systems, and a lot of that is coming in from researchers looking to identify what tools we have and working collectively with the community, saying, here's the place that we've measured, here are some of the students and local residents who want to be part of these solutions and get involved with measurements. And so we bring that together into this trade-off analysis, which I'm going to talk about a little bit before getting over my and then the idea is we iterate on that and we get potential ethical pathways. So maybe one example that the extreme heat one. And people have heard us talk about extreme heat before, we've been here because it's iterative. So I'm hoping that every time we talk about a little further towards a consensus on this. So just talk about extreme heat, we all know issue in Baltimore, I think, and you had really not this summer, I think we also solved it. So what does deliberation look like? And so people were, again, a bunch of people got together and Morgan State almost exactly a year ago, more or less, right? And we had some focus groups, right? And we all got together and said, okay, what are our metrics? What are we trying to solve for? Well, we want to be cool, right? But like why? Like, what does it matter to my community, different members of my community? What are they trying to achieve? Whether they want kids to get play outside, if they are concerned about direct health impacts themselves, if they're about transportation, all those other things, right? The cost of the air conditioning. So we talked about those concerns. Okay, let's now then pair that with some measurement and modeling, right? And so this is just, sorry, that's blurry. It's an imperfect map just showing a whole bunch of instrumentation going out in Baltimore. And so it's you can see the colors of the black butterfly there. We're trying to really concentrate measurements in parts of our community that have not, that are not having sufficient information. And so making sure that we're working in partnership with folks like a bunch of people in this room, temple like schools, other school groups, church organizations, and a lot of great volunteer substations, equipment all over the city. So that we can get the measurements we need to understand heat as it's distributed. And a big part of this effort has been weather stations, and so a lot of you guys know Darren Wall, Professor Hawkins, he's been in your backyard or something, right? Invited usually, you don't know. Working on getting weather stations out with Dr. Shamar from Morgan State and others in partnership to say, okay, let's get these weather stations out in places where we care about that don't have access to information like this, and let's post them there, make sure the information displayed in the church or the school so you can see it happening, and we can all pool the information together to get a better understanding. And this was some information Darren sent out in late June, which people might remember was like ungodly hot. And the redder colors mean it's hotter, right? And it's nighttime on the left, daytime on the right, showing things that we know intuitively, right? That like some of our neighborhoods are hotter than others, but also quantifying that and showing that it was, 8 degrees hotter at night in some parts of East Baltimore than it was in some of the wealthier neighborhoods north of the city, right? And so these are things that we can really begin to quantify and understand, and then bring it together with some other information that I'll talk about in a moment to talk about why we might care about that, what we do that. So, okay, but that's our measurement system, right? And then we bring it together in this trade-off analysis. So what's the trade-off analysis? It's okay, we've all talked about like what we're trying to solve for. Fewer people dying, less, more equity between neighborhoods, lower energy costs, less asthma, whatever it is. We put it in there. We do a bunch of work to try to understand those relationships. We then come together and say, okay, based on what we measured, we know that we want to understand how might the city invest. And these are like things that were proposed, and they aren't yet the potential pathways. We got to iterate a few times, right? But this is some work that Craig mentioned Ali at Hawkins made these graphics, and what we got here are 4 indicative ways that we can invest. So we're showing for analysis of the city how much money would it take over multiple decades, so it's spread out over time, to try to achieve what we can on reducing mortality and improving equity. The one on the top right is saying let's do a lot of greening. And these are imperfect, right? So there are lots of different ways to do greening, but this is a model, so let's do it in a way that's efficient, right? And so if you efficiently invest in greening, that's where the dollars end up going in that particular pathway. The bottom left is infrastructure, that's like cool roofs, cool pavements, some other kind of like eliminating hardscaping, these kinds of solutions. And it has a very different pattern of where the investments end up, right? And there are literally hundreds of these options, right? These are just a few that are indicative that they're different how they invest in. Each one is optimal with respect to something. It's like the best at something, right? But not at everything. And it's metrics that when we get together again, we say, okay, what does or doesn't work here? What do we need to change in our thinking in order to come up with a pathway that actually does make sense to us, right? And if you look at these, like just to give an example of these, that one that says that's infrastructure focused ends up saving fewer lives than the one that says it's green focused in our analysis based on our best understanding, right? But it's more equitable, right? It saves lives in neighborhoods of higher vulnerability than the green focused one, right? And these are kinds of there's no right answer, these are conversations, right? How do we channel these resources in a way that achieve what we collectively find acceptable? Okay, So we do that and now we're iterating. So again, Anna says these are not the answer. This is one attempt and then we go back and thank people who participated in some small focus group that we had about a month ago. We continue to meet with smaller subsets of people to get really deep dive conversation about how we make these meaningful for the city. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is, why are we doing this? And this is absolutely, I think this is a situation of real mutual benefit. And I want to point out that through BSEC, Baltimore communities are doing tremendous amounts of science. So, here we are, a couple blocks from here with Kelly, right, and doing a little tour of the neighborhood. And we got a bunch of students coming down to understand what the community goals are and what some of the solutions are they do. So learning that, helping the scientists, the researchers understand what the community already knows and how we can channel that and how we can help empower that knowledge with some of the quantitative measurements. I hope in a really literal sense, folks are hosting instrumentation. Thank you so much, right? So we get out there with this is at our church in Baltimore, putting out a web station, and again, it's like getting not only just to help with the instrumentation, but then getting some of the younger folks out there with us so that they can become part of the scientific enterprise. It's a huge service that the community should provide, by inspiring and encouraging some of the younger people of the community to get involved. And then even the much younger people, so the kind of like schools, right? And these are students that are, I think it's contributing to science both in terms of, it's actually a measurement taken, right? You're actually getting into the analysis, but it's also that the capacity that he now has, right? That he knows how to do this, and that he is talking about this and bringing this information to his community. I think it's so critical. That's like science needs that. And it goes the other way too. And so what, that's what the community gave to us. Like, what can we give to the community while we do the science? And I try to put this in 3 ways. Okay, so one way is that they're trying to move from what I would say from argument to evidence. And so one thing that I often find myself saying is I'll show a result and I'll say something like, well, we already know that, right? Like, we know it's hot downtown, right? We know this, we know that. And in some sense that's true, but sometimes it's not documented in a way that we use. Okay. And sometimes it turns out to be a little different than we thought. And sometimes there are details that really matter. Like, oh yeah, the trees cool things down, but which trees, right? What's the soil like? How are we watering? Where are we placing them, right? And so we can move from a general argument to something that's actually evidence-based as we seek to get pedestrians in our city. That evidence then moves us to action. So whether it's because we've got the resources, we have the evidence to support what we want to do, or whether it's that we're convincing each other, we're having this conversation, saying, well, now why we know we need to do that for maybe some people who are disagreeing about strategies. Like, well, look at the strategies that actually make sense because we have this evidence that can support it. And then the other thing that he said is really important is evaluate, right? So there are a lot of solutions out there that are good for different reasons. We are not great at measuring what things are good for. We have a real street map problem. Like, everything we do on the environment and climate, right, is for that, oh, we want green because it's going to cool things down. And we are measuring whether green cools things down, right? We are measuring whether it reduces storm flow. But sometimes it doesn't, the dollar work, it doesn't. But maybe it's achieving some other benefits. Maybe it's like, well, it didn't get a lot cooler, but it had some social benefit, right? Or had some other advantage in that being a street or it offered a recreation space, it does other things. And we want to make sure that's counted, right? So we figure out these solutions are meeting all communities, and then we evaluate and we take new action, adjust if needed, so that we can try to avoid preventable content. Okay, and just to close a little bit of fun and a little bit of science here. I'm not going to go off to a long science talk, but this has already been long. But the along the way, we are getting some really cool scientific results. All right, I'm not sure the community is aware of this. That this is not, yes, some of the stuff like directly answering questions that all communities have, and then a bunch of it is like doing groundbreaking best in the world science here in Baltimore. And so this is the mom and pop thing. We got that's here. Ben Hall's here. He and Pete Carl and others help run mom and pops. Some of your community meetings. I know it's super sophisticated way to measure air quality and as well as greenhouse gases. You just get a couple things and Ben folks are out. But But what we can do is we can map this stuff out, and so they can drive around Baltimore and say, where are pollution hotspots? In this case, it's in terms of NO2, they measure a lot of different things, it's related to traffic and other sources. And so then again, this documentation, understanding, yeah, we know that communities are concerned about trucks idling, they're concerned about traffic, right? So here we know what's happening, right, in extreme detail. And then on the right, natural gas things, it's methane, right? This is so natural gas, natural infrastructure at certain levels of natural health, right? We got old gas lines. So if things are running in red on that line, there's more methane than should be, right? And so being able to map out that infrastructure can really help to inform solutions, right? Okay, we're good. Let's do that. And then the heat. So measuring temperature everywhere. Then we go to this is a student, who's then run some analysis on the weather stations that are put out there and other temperature measurements. He comes up with what is the day-to-day, how hot or cold is it compared to like a central weather station. So what are the places that are hot? And why does it matter to have that detail everywhere all the time? Because then what she's able to do is combine it with some health records from Johns Hopkins Hospital, right? And say, okay, is the heat hurting people? And again, really preliminary results, like all the press stuff, but what you find is that if you count the number of emergency room visits by kids with asthma, that blue thing there, don't worry, the details, it's colored because it's significant, statistically significant. If you have a heat wave, you're gonna get more kids at Hopkins ER with asthma. And where are the kids who are going to the Hopkins ER coming from? Predominantly Baltimore, right? And so, and this again is something people kind of probably think, right? They kind of know, but like this is about trying to really use the data collected about the community to get the information the community needs to advocate for itself. And also like again, thanks to all the participating educational activities we did this last summer. Getting out with the youth work students, getting out with the young folks at Temple X as terrorist king, there was no one in the top left there, Plantation Park Heights, the Farm and Chippies crew, down at Green Street Academy, doing some soil sampling, Academy Office, and then her team out there doing the soil state, kids playing with earthworms, right? Yeah. Yes, lots of kids with worms. And so, and which has been like, first of all, it's fun, but also I think that's another thing that we have some really ambitious goals together, right? About transforming the city, and also part of that is the process and getting the kids involved in this. I think it's been really valuable. And if you're here and not done this kind of stuff, thinking about ways to get involved, these are great ways for the organization to get involved in the project. And the last thing before I transition, I just want to point out, one thing I always forget to do at these talks like this, I forget to give it up for like the students at the universities and stuff that are doing these projects and the researchers that work with them. Like, I just want to say, like, this is a tremendous amount of work. Right? And so the folks in the lab, the folks who Darren convinced to come out and set up weather stations within, doing the soil sampling in the river, biking around in a heat wave to try to measure how hot it is, right? Sacrificing your body. And then this bottom right one is going out to do soil, putting some soil probes on data that was so hot and dry that they had to pack it up and go home. Like they sweated it out for a couple hours and then just couldn't do it, right? Because it was so hot. And so thank you to all the students and the researchers who are working on this with us as well. And the last result I'm going to show, just to scare Julia because I didn't tell her I was going to show this. So we're from Morgan State, right? And I'm using this as a pivot point. There's another, I think, cool scientific thing that's happened past years where Julia, Italian, James Hunter, and others at Morgan State have done, trying to look at some of these flooding areas in collaboration with Department of Public Works and saying, okay, and we almost said, oh, what you do? Perfect, right? But trying to look at, well, can we start modeling and understanding how interventions could influence flooding as we simulated, and then we got some 311 reports, and then we also continue to get local information about what flood risk is, and like saying around Cherry Hill, Broadway East, other neighborhoods around the city. And I want to close with this because today we are focusing on flooding. All right, this is preliminary work. We're just getting going on flooding. We also know that flooding is a really complex problem, right? And so we're going to talk, we're here for DCRC, and we're going to talk in the breakout rooms about priorities about flooding, think about some local solutions that serve multiple community needs, and also recognize that this requires everyone. It's a multi-scale problem. I mean, we're going to live here, you can throw something at me wrong, but I think that the communities can help. but they can't solve, like, no one can even solve this on their own, right? We have like large scale issues that require strong collaboration from city agencies, from others, right? To really make sure that we can solve this with the large scale infrastructure and the local solutions we need. And that requires this kind of collaboration. And that's kind of the point here, to get us all talking together so we can start saying, well, here are pathways that engage everyone in the way they need to be engaged. So I'm gonna stop there. Maybe I'll take some questions, Kelly, while you get ready to do the slide from BCRC. Okay, thanks. So I'll open up, we schedule lots of time for questions. We'd love to hear questions, comments, whatever people have. And this is mine, it's not on the board, so let's hear we should. Down the hand, right? Yeah.
So, great presentation, thank you. What government officials have seen this?
I've seen this, yeah, so it depends by government officials. Lots of our partners who are working in government agencies have seen this, done this with us, right? So, this stuff that worked into some of the results are in the DP3 plan that the Department of Health, the disaster preparedness plan, it's in there, working with them on the climate action plan, standard plan. So we got good partners there. We talk regularly with partners DPW, where you're here today, some of the stuff that's there. If we're talking about government officials, like bringing up the political change, I'll be honest, we have not done a lot of that yet. And so that's something that I think, as the results are more mature, maybe sooner, that was something we should be doing, but I don't know if any others have comments on the best way. If that's, I don't want to misunderstand your question, right? When you say government officials, like pre-government.
Decision makers.
Decision makers, right? So I think, decisions happen at different levels, right? So I think we're talking with some of the decision makers. When it comes to the high level decision makers, I think that people are like move big sums in political processes. I am not directly engaged with them much yet, but it's something we need to do. I don't know, Dr. George and Kelly, have any thoughts on how this stuff gets brought to decision makers more powerful than they have already? Or do you have comments? Okay, let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Hi, I'm Mariah Davis. I am the Environmental Justice Officer for the state, so I'm here to help support and learn.
All right. Right, here we go. Here we go. Good. Yeah.
We have shared a lot of this information with some of our local elected officials who are within those spaces that we consider unhelpful for us. By that, those elected officials to Annapolis, we have shared this with and begged passionately for support. We've also shared that with several of our city elected officials as we beg for support and recognition of the issues that we're facing. Have we done a good job? A fair job. So we're moving to do a better.
Doing it uniformly across the city. And I applaud all your work. But have we done the same on the west side as you've done on the east side?
Yeah. Well, let's get right there, actually. Yeah, you want?
Let me acknowledge. We appreciate you because you're here today. So that means that that relationship has started to share. We will move that forward because as you just brought that to the surface, we do need to make this a holistic approach. It's not an east, a west, a north, or a south. It's about us people surviving what we've identified. So I appreciate it. And we will start together.
Yeah, and from the science side, I'll say something similar, which is that it's something we have wrestled with from the beginning, right? Which is like Baltimore, it's both small and huge at the same time. And so one thing that we're trying to do is how can we really learn our way forward? Because we fail a fair bit of friends here, right? And so like, how do we like get it moving and then stand out? Because we don't want to get ahead of ourselves sometimes, so we're trying to take a tiered approach. But like we don't have a lot of time to get through that. We need to start moving out as much as we can this coming year.
Thank
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Keep going, there you go.
I think it's important for our young people to be involved in what's going on. And I appreciate what involvement we were able to bring this summer. How do we further that? They need to hear the results. They need to know the impacts. And it was good this summer, but I want to take it to the next level.
Yeah. And thank you for wanting to take it to the next level. So that's the goal this year, right? Really take it to the next level. I think the work we did this year, with huge thanks to the communities, the Kalia Young, coordinating that, and Derek also getting some of this stuff started. Like we got to put in the work, right? We start a relationship, we get to know each other, we get the kids hopefully a little bit excited about it. But there's a tremendous amount more we can do, and I also have tremendous energy for that on the research side, like wanting to engage on these things. And now with every passing month, we have more and more that we know, more results, more things to talk about. And so I think what we need to do, we focus on summer, maybe we don't, that's a conversation, maybe we don't need to focus on summer. But certainly by next summer, we want to have teed up like a tour de force, really try to focus up. Yeah.
I see a Baltimore weather for.
Yeah.
You know, that is a thing, and we can.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you work around year round.
Mhm.
I see that happening. The vision.
Yeah, that's what, and I think it's a vision that is like really achievable, right? So you just said that there are resources there. It's interesting. Like we really can do it. It's just waiting for us to grab it, right? So we need to make that happen. Right, and then Kel that.
Yeah, I actually have a follow up on that. That was a good question about what we do with our officials. Decision makers, because one thing I've noticed, I've got a background in politics and in lobbying, local, federal, and state levels, is a lot of times our officials don't really see. It's very difficult to make them prioritize climate and environmental issues. There's a lot of lip service paid to it, especially in a blue state like America. People talk about it a lot. I think there is the intent to do things around it. But quite often, when push comes to shove, people make the decision, well, where they see a binary, they see you have to choose economic development or climate, or this climate thing you're talking about is too expensive, and we want to focus on the jobs program. They're looking at it as either or instead of both and. Instead of recognizing that if you're focusing on really good, implementable, sustainable climate solutions, you can actually create an economy around it. You can bring in small businesses. Small businesses are going to be more willing to come into a neighborhood that has lots of trees and greenery and it's a pleasant place to walk around than in a place that is barren and all concrete. So it's partially about combining it and making sure elected officials know that some of the other objectives they're trying to meet can also be met through climate resilient solutions. So with that, I will turn to a slide show that we've got here, and it's, hope you all can see that, okay? This is a little blurry. You know, the screen. Let me see if I can. Yeah, that might be okay, great. Yeah, okay. So we just got back, myself, Dr. Myers Terrell, my husband Matej, from a trip to the Netherlands. So a little background, I have spent a lot of time living, working, practicing law school in Germany. And I've spent a lot of time continuing to go back and forth to Europe, and a lot of the kind of climate resilience solutions that we thought about and have begun to implement here in Goucher have been inspired in one way, shape, or form from just sort of our experience living in Europe. And when I say Europe, I should kind of drill that down a little bit more to, I would say, Central Europe, because I think when we're talking about some of these really advanced climate solutions, particularly around water and flooding, you see those solutions most effectively implemented in places like the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, sort of Central Europe. So we were invited recently, having done a lot of work with the Embassy of the Netherlands as well as the Embassy of Denmark. And they are looking to bring many of those solutions to the US and see how some of the things that they've learned can be implemented here, and some of the things that we know can be implemented in those countries. So we went over, we just got back, I guess, just last week. Yeah, just got back this weekend. And that's our glamour shot in a park. And you know, I have this, you know, this is just a picture. Hague is a beautiful city. You know, and I think it's a great peer city for us to look at, because it is roughly the same population size as Baltimore. I think it's like 550,000, somewhere about there, which is roughly where Baltimore City is right now. And it's also interesting because it's in Europe's most densely populated mega region, similar to what we have here in the US, here in the Baltimore area. You know, we're within the Northeast megalopolis, which is, you know, the most densely concentrated populated part of the United States. So similar with the Hague, it's in the you know, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Düsseldorf, Frankfurt, that sort of mega region. It's also on the water's edge, and is dealing with a number of issues around flooding and pollutants. As I was saying earlier, you know, I think the Netherlands is perhaps the most advanced nation in the world when it comes to flooding. You know, Netherlands means lowlands, Nederland. It means that it's, you know, much of the country is actually below sea level. If you all know your medieval history, you know that the Netherlands has suffered some of the most catastrophic flooding in human history. You know, tens of thousands of people have died over hundreds of years in the Netherlands in major floods. So they've had centuries to come up with solutions and take this stuff very seriously. But also increasingly now, with a lot of climate change impacts we're seeing, they are starting to deal with things like the urban heat island effect, summer heat waves. So, you know, in Europe, particularly, wouldn't have air conditioners in the past, and now you see people installing air conditioners because it's getting hot in the summer. Now, when it comes to the issue of flooding, I love this. They've got a lot of different, you know, pictures that they use for this, but the general notion is this idea of slow the flow. So it's not just when they're talking about stormwater runoff and preventing flooding, it's not just about, you know, where do you divert it or where do you store it, or these big solutions. One of the big things that they've discovered is you deal with flooding by just making sure you're slowing the amount of water that's coming through at any given time, at any given point in a major water event. So it's about slowing the flow. And the main way that they do this, and this is something that when we moved back to the States, you know, was jarring to me, but I think you start to really understand when you are kind of going back and you're seeing it in the context of what we know, you know, the infrastructure questions we're asking here, is in the US, Baltimore is particularly bad with this, but all of the US cities that suffer from this. We have this obsession with concrete as our pavement material. Sidewalks, asphalt roads, driveways, we pave consistently, totally impervious surfaces. And it's funny, if you ever walk around, you know this because of all the concrete, you know, for the 800 trees we planted in this neighborhood. I don't know how many, you know, tons of concrete we've had to take up through that, but often you know, jackhammer up a sidewalk and see that the sidewalk is that thick, just concrete. Totally superfluous, trapping heat. And so one of the key things that you'll see in these European cities, particularly in the Netherlands, is pavers, and more pavers. Pavers on sand. And I like this because this is a very simple solution. So we can talk about all the different permeable surfaces and more high-tech solutions for dealing with excessive stormwater runoff. But one of the easiest things that you can do, that they do in the Netherlands, is use pavers on sand. We'll go into some pictures of that. But again, as I said, this is the key to slowing the flow, reducing flooding, and filtering pollutants from those countries in Central Europe. It's a very simple thing, but the joints between the pavers create myriad opportunities for stormwater to be captured and filtered. Now, when you're looking at a joint, you're looking at pavers on sand, you just see little joints. It doesn't look like much. But when you start to extrapolate that over large swaths of land, you think about how many of those joints kind of add up. You start adding up into big chunks of land area that are now pervious. Another thing that they do great is above and below ground water storage solutions, so that they ensure that stormwater runoff doesn't just go and pollute their waterways. So just walking around, just taking pictures at night to show kind of, I think, some of the differences between the way we do basic pedestrian infrastructure here in the US versus what they do there. And I don't know if you can see it too well, but you'll see just pavers everywhere. One thing I find interesting, you'll see those bollards in the middle. We'll typically see this in sort of Central European cities. They'll have areas that are open for cars during the day. And then in the evening or on weekends, they have, movable bollards that, automatically can raise up. So when you drive through, it becomes a pedestrian. Just another picture here. I think I may have been the same street, but just looking in a different direction. And of course, very different culture around bikes and bicycling. And obviously, in order to get the sort of density that you need to support the number of successful small local businesses that they have there, you have to be able to get people in large numbers. You don't want to do that in an urban environment, walking, cycling, or public transit. So I thought this picture is very interesting. And this is something that my husband had begun to realize in terms of tree health in Baltimore. As you walk around that, you'll see these tree canopies are amazing. Huge tree canopies, large, shading across major avenues and streets. Here in Baltimore, because we have paved over so much, our only option to allow trees to grow healthily and to have the soil volume they need is to create big tree pits. So we have to break things up and create these huge tree pits, which also it can sometimes in more narrow spaces really impact the flow of pedestrian traffic. People are having to walk around the tree pit and get the weeds, you complain about that. And I just highlight that in these scenarios, there's one example. Here's another. When you have your entire surface area that is just on sand, and very simple, no complex solution, just on sand, you're able to start growing massive trees with virtually no shade. The entire surface area of the street, even under you'll see the street itself, that's where cars drive, that's also pavers, and that's the minimum. The roots of that tree are all throughout. So it's getting air, it's getting water, nutrients, etc. This is another great thing. It's something that we began implementing here in the neighborhood. If you go around the corner to one of our businesses called Dutch Courage, you'll see that is around the street. We put in a number of what we call facade gardens, something that's very popular in the Netherlands. And what they do is, even in places here, you've got a sidewalk of pavers, but you'll take out the portion in front of the house and put in a little garden. That's something you'll see throughout the city, the most urban parts of the city, the more suburban parts. And it's ironic because when we began doing that in this community, we're getting a lot of pushback from people saying, "Oh, we don't want our basement to flood." There was the assumption that somehow you would get more flooding because you had this stuff taken out in front. It's actually the opposite. One thing that we discovered is that when you pave all the way up to the edge of your house, water gets trapped, and it typically will wick up the side of the house. One of the reasons you see a lot of the facades are bowling in Baltimore, that water wicks up, and it also will trap moisture in the basement and cellar of the houses. So again, facade garden there. It's another kind of typical street. This one does have a bit of a tree pit, but again, the bicycles, and this is more of a standard street. You've got your cars there, you've got your bicycles, but again, everything is pavered on sand. So one thing I love about pavers on sand, sorry, I keep going on about pavers, but it's the, as we were explaining kind of the way we do things in Baltimore, we kept getting, we met with a number of government officials there. They kept on scratching their heads, when they, and the source was there with us. They kept saying, well, why do you do that? And I think we were talking about concrete and the way we build our streets and sidewalks. I didn't really give an example, I mean, a reason, and they were asking us, isn't that really expensive over the long term? You know, and again, when I say expensive, I mean in terms of when you're anything with concrete and asphalt, every time you make a repair, you gotta come in, bring a crew, they have to jackhammer it up, repair, then send another crew back out to pave it back over. If a mistake was made, got another crew coming back out, jackhammering, repaving. It's this constant, never-ending, very expensive cycle. I think it's deceptive in a place like Baltimore because it seems cheap short term. But when you start adding those costs over, you know, years, decades, you're spending significantly more money and making something upkeep. So I point out this, this curve. May not look very special or interesting, but all of their curves are modular, which means that whenever a repair has to happen, they just take out those pieces, make the repair, and they can put it back. So, you know, new curves, we do concrete curves, it's stuck in place, they have pass the concrete in. But this curve, and they have sort of, they designed it so they have interchangeable pieces, so if they decide they don't need this curve anymore, they'll take those pieces and put them into another location that has similar dimensions. Another great thing here, is things like crosswalks. You notice here in the US, particularly in Baltimore, crosswalks, lanes are consistently, they get worn out, the paint gets worn out, you can't see the markings on the street. And this is one of the places where they were really asking us why we do it that way. Because there, they create, they have colored pavers where the color of the paper is, it's not painted on, it's actually the color of the paper. So when they put a crosswalk in, that crosswalk is permanent. If they want to create new crosswalks or move a crosswalk, they just take up the pavers, move them elsewhere. But there's no continued maintenance budget for going around and striping and restriping crosswalks, for instance. That's a little bit more of a close-up look at that. And again, you can see here, just those little joints in between. Doesn't look like a lot, but that's a very key ingredient of the slow to flow dynamic. Water coming through there in a big rain event, you know, a lot of it's going to still wash away, but there's a significant portion of that that's going to get trapped in those crevices and it's going to slowly seep down through soil. Here was just walking around. This is a crew laying papers. And to your point, ma'am, about the sort of political dynamic and we talking about the workforce development. One thing I think we need to be cognizant of when we're talking about infrastructure is this type of solution that is simply a matter of learning to lay pavers can employ a lot more people. And people don't have to have some complicated skill set to do it. There's not some huge barrier to entry. So when you're talking about concrete everywhere, what I've seen in Baltimore, typically that means the city goes out and hires some large contracting firm. That contracting firm has to have the capacity to not only create concrete, but have the big trucks and all the things necessary for that. And this was actually a huge project that they were building right here, so it's a little more involved. But on a typical street, you will just see they just have crews of people, unskilled people who know how to just lay pavers. And those are jobs, local jobs in communities for local infrastructure. Actually, it's a video. Yeah. So that's that. Another sidewalk, bikes, very standard sidewalk. This is something I want to show in terms of maintenance with these pavers. So you'll see that it looks kind of dirty. That's a lot of sand on top of it. So their entire maintenance protocol in these Dutch cities for their sidewalks, and here in Baltimore, you know, we wait for our cities are heaved up and cracked, and you gotta wait forever, and it's terrible. And it's yeah, they come through with a huge crew maybe every decade or more to redo the sidewalks. With pavers on sand, their whole maintenance protocol is I think that every every 2 years, 2 to 3 years, they just bring the crew through and the crew just kind of pours sand out on the sidewalk. Just to kind of refill all the grooves and everything in between. So that sand sits there kind of in a little bit of a messy state for a few months, but over time, the storms kind of washes some of the sand away, gets dragged off, but that's their maintenance protocol. It does not involve people coming back and relaying pavers and relaying, infrastructure, it's just putting sand on the sidewalks. Again, another baller there, I think this is a video, so you can see how it moves. Yeah, just like that. Very simple. This was a plaza, beautiful plaza, apartments around. Again, this isn't really a BSEC climate issue, but again, I think one of the reasons you see so much more success with the urban vitality of European cities is because they really have honed in on the density piece. And one thing I will say about those cities, I think often in the US, I'll hear people say, oh, that's Europe, that's its own thing, they got historic cities, we don't have that here. But that just belies, I would say, ignorance about European cities, because that's not the case. In the 1980s, late 70s into about the mid to even late 80s, many European cities, The Hague, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, they were taking this American approach. They began paving over their riverfronts. They began going in with the auto-oriented development. They began going in with the concrete and more suburban style housing. And at some point in the early 90s, for different reasons, most of those countries decided to take a hard tack back. So this whole culture, when you see people biking around Copenhagen, biking around The Hague, Amsterdam, this wasn't something that was always there. This is actually a phenomenon that's emerged really in the last 30 to 40 years in those countries. So it's not that they've got some foreign culture, it's just something they decided over the last several decades to focus on. Another instance of stormwater solutions, you'll see many of the light rail and tram lines in these European cities will have grass underneath them. So that the trains run very quietly, very smoothly through the city, you really can't even hear them. And they use every opportunity they can to introduce vegetation, stormwater filtration, and it's just beautiful. It's just a much better visual attraction for neighborhoods. And the last thing I'll point out, this is kind of a little bit of a little different, but we had the opportunity to visit a park there, and this was Kromlevie Park. And so in the Hague, they have 10 parks set up around the city that are parks focused on young people, connecting young people with recreation facilities and animals. And I know that might sound a little odd, they have full-on zoo like we have here, but these are totally public parks where they're focusing on what they call animal therapy with children. And they really put a lot of resources into these animal parks in communities that have had issues with violence, where they have a lot of immigrants are moving in, people of color, and it's kind of their real attempt to begin integrating people into that society. So we went to visit this park. We'll have, I think, Matthias will have some, we have called drain blocks around these Dutch sort of underground water retention solutions that are buried throughout this park to actually store water, slow the flow. One thing I love about it is around this park, all the buildings around it, all the housing around it, they have what they call blue roofs. And water that hits those roofs all is filtered down and is all, so it doesn't just flow into the streets like we'll typically see in Baltimore, like what are they called? Yes, yeah, spout kind of just coming down, letting the water on the street. All of the water from those buildings comes underground and comes into the park. And it's stored in a variety of underground storage systems of both filtration systems, large tanks, and they use that water for a number of purposes. And this park was absolutely amazing. This is a great place to actually store, And the second floor of this, calculated with the art, very, again, to what we are doing wrong, I think, in Baltimore. We got stuck up in this whole, Euclidean zoning thing decades ago. Houses here, commercial here, it's very difficult to mix different uses. That's one of the reasons we're having affordable housing crisis. They're solving this by putting housing in all sorts of places. So again, housing within the park above where animals are kept. There's Dr. Doris with a chicken. So they've got chickens there, pigs, cows, goats. They make honey there, and it was amazing to see like this young lady. She grew up, she just talked about how challenging her childhood was with her family, and she grew up going to that park. And now, as an adult, she's decided to come back, and now she works at that park. And there were a number of those people who were just talking about how integral and crucial that park was to really saving their lives. Another example, so under this whole yard here, there were drain blocks, water is captured, stored. That basement area there used to flood consistently. That basement apartment, no more flooding since the drain blocks are below. And then last slide, this is not necessarily a BSEC climate issue, but just again around how we need to start thinking differently in Baltimore around just our general infrastructure. How we handle infrastructure in the city. This is a trash can, right? So, typically in St. Baltimore, we'll put our trash cans out in the alleys. Crews come through with these big trucks, stuff is falling all over the place. We've been really unfortunate since we've had DPW workers who have passed recently. In the Netherlands, what they do, this whole metal thing under that is a huge, garbage collection unit. And you'll see kind of the hooks on top. You put your trash in there, every week, and there's one per block. So every week, the trash truck comes and it just lifts that thing out from the ground. It goes down pretty deep, puts it into the truck and drives off. So it's a very simple and compact solution for collecting trash. So, end of the show. Thank you.
Two questions. I live in Howard Park, and we have a lot of tree pits there where trees have been taken up because they were dead or what have you. And nothing has been planted on my so what they said in the Netherlands, they just replant and refill these tree pits so that they're not.
Yeah, and they have a pretty significant budget around their tree work. I should take some pictures of the trees by themselves, but they have a campaign of trimming these trees up really high. And I think they have much less tree death and tree loss, because one thing we see in Baltimore, people planting trees, all these groups go around planting trees, and it's a huge mortality rate where
We have tree plantings going on. But the other thing is, one of the problems in Baltimore City, a lot of dead trees, a lot of large dead trees. And it's a problem getting those taken care of because they're had. They had. But, another question, the cost wall pavers.
yes.
Have you discussed that with the city? Because around all of these schools that we have, they're supposed to be painted, crosswalks. And like you said, if they're there, they become faded and fixed, and get them replaced. And that sounds like a very viable situation. That would be like probably not all and longer. I'm just wondering if anybody in the city government side, whether it's VP government or one further up, has been introduced to this concept.
We have not yet. And so we just got back from this, and I wanna take this, this presentation, I'm actually taking a number of our council people, incoming council people to Miami, to see some things that they're doing down there, very soon. So I wanna start using those opportunities and really starting to push to say, we can do better.
So you were saying this isn't a climate thing, but I have an idea of how we can focus it on climate. Concrete is a huge source of CO2 in the manufacturing usage of it. Was there any discussion in how less CO2 was being produced or used in the pavers? And can pavers help reduce our carbon footprint in Baltimore if we go down there?
It's a good question. We didn't discuss that, that didn't come up, but my inclination would be, just the difference in how much concrete is produced. So if you're making a paper and your intention of that paper is for the life cycle of that to be indefinite, that just means you're not gonna be making concrete every time you do a repair. So I would have to imagine that it's positive in that sense. Yes, absolutely. That's good. Okay.
One other aspect about concrete is that it does affect water quality. So we sample some of those streams, in fall. So it's just another water quality, those aspects of the environment.
Yes.
Which it's often
I think you're right, yeah, and filtration piece, I mean, that's really key, the water gets, if you get below that ground, at least some will be filtered by the ground below.
yeah, it's tough. Now, too, I mean, so it's dissolving.
Dissolving.
Dissolving material, the tree that gets dissolved.
Yeah. Same.
Like, when I was looking at the thing, that you had, which was, that is why I think that, oh, no,
Yes,
or is that just now?
no, that's all levels, so the part that I was showing you, I didn't quite tell, but this is all around, the city. Well, one thing also about those cities is, was telling Doris when we were there, we kind of have this, because we're so, I think, used to it in the US, the idea there's a good neighborhood and a bad neighborhood. Particularly what you see there are neighborhoods that are, more affluent, less affluent, but all of the amenities and all the basic infrastructure is the same across neighborhoods. They were describing to us their sort of, they're building a whole new part of the city that we went to visit in an old industrial area. And whereas here in the US, we kind of say, oh, we let a developer build something here and then, maybe something later, we don't really coordinate it. There, if a developer builds a certain number of units, it automatically triggers requirements for a certain amount for healthcare space, for instance, a certain amount of parkland, a certain amount of grocery space. It is all required, no matter what development you're building and in what area. Yes.
People in fact that green space is intentional based on population, and that the 10 parks, they talk about intentional based on population, based on stress reduction, based on trauma. Intentional green spaces.
Yes, they put in, for example, the one we visited, that was actually one of their most high crime areas in the Netherlands. So when they put that park there, and there's apartments around it, low income housing, and apartments that were built specifically around that park. They put in more resources in that park around the animal therapy piece for the children. They had some amazing things where they have like a goat, named the goat. There's a goat that goes out with the kids every week and they go around and pick up trash around the neighborhood with the goat. And the goat's like famous in the neighborhood. The kids love it. So I mean, that's a broader issue around like a difference in society, but I think the Dutch have a much more egalitarian society in that sense, at least in their inner cities.
I just want to say that there is some piece of consider that in Netherlands, the geographic area is not flat. That's why we use more lands. Yes. And I do think that, yeah, we need also to, this project, we need to use here. We need to consider that, breeds to be really sustained on their.
Alright, I think, yeah, we were, I got to go, we got so, thank you so much, Kelly, Dr. We're going to. Inspire us to think of how we can transform our city. And so great food for thought, we'll get food for stomachs in a moment. First of all, I'm gonna bring up though, Mr. Hongwu from Penn State, he's gonna talk about what we're gonna do. The way we're gonna do this is we're gonna grab lunch, get public to say hi to Grant, then try to get some of these breakout rooms, so really start talking about the solution to Baltimore. And also tell us how we're gonna do that.
Good afternoon, I'm home. I realize I'm standing between you and lunch, so we're gonna do this very quickly. First, I wanna very quickly introduce my moderators. I'm one of the moderators, and at the back of the room, we have Lisa Aiello, professor in architecture from Penn State. She will be leading room 1, which is here. So room 1 will stay here. Second will be my wonderful PhD student, Masa Adi. She will be leading room 2, which is upstairs. Turn left. Well, she will lead you. She'll lead you. I'm going to be in room 3, upstairs. Turn right. So now I'm actually going to ask all the researchers, BSEC researchers, to stand up. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for remaining standing, but apologies. It's the next session, the focus group is going to be less about you. For those who are sitting, we're going to do it the kindergarten way. We're going to count 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry. That's the best way I came up with to do this. So we're going to go this way. For those of you that will be in the focus group, let's maybe start with counting. 1, yeah, this one, 2, 3. Right, 1, 2, 2.
Okay. Yep. And then so And making sure we will get out of sunlight for the end of the day. So, what we're gonna do is on those lovely.
Take care.
Two separate panels, but our panelists generate the opportunity to, speak together on one panel. So that'll save us a little, one at a time. And we have Professor James Hunter, who's way towards the front of the crowd, having speak to moderate this panel for us. James, I don't know if you want to do, you want to go chair, just hold the mic, I can stand. You're gonna stand back there, I'll do them over them, they can stand behind them. Here you go. I'm gonna hand this over to James, so what we'll do, just, so we're gonna do this panel, we cover these topics, and then we'll just close things up at the end of the panel. Yeah, so, if you're planning ahead, we're gonna try to wrap this thing up, right? Okay, here we go.
Thank you, Ben. As an introduction, I'm James Hunter, Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Morgan State. I want to introduce our panel here. We're going to work to the panel. Let's remind everybody. So, first person I'll introduce is Justin Berry. This is with the Green Healthy Home Initiative. We have Valerie Russ. Valerie's with the Office of Sustainability. We have Jonathan Moore, the Bradley Orphan. And we also have Kim Truman from Liberty Village Project. And Dr. Doris Meyer from BCRC. So our first question is to just have you guys please introduce yourself and say a bit about your organization or how your organization's goals try to be climate resilience and environmental justice. So Jonathan, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I can do that. I don't need like pretty loud to get to it. John, the board, founder of Rally Orbit, what we do, we leverage broadband infrastructure to really build out digital transformation. And communities that make $39,000 per household. And the way that we got into the climate aspect of it was that we look at IoT products, Internet of Things products, and ways to measure clean air, clean water, as well as clean soil. And how do we take that data that's really made bottom-up decisions from the community-based organization? And so that way we train people on how to become data scientists. So there's a workforce development element into it. So that way there's a bottom-up approach to the community that can cover a gap where the government doesn't cover or the government's slow. And so we look at this to a form that's driving between sovereignty and not waiting for things to happen, rather than making things happen, rather than idly standing by without.
Hi everyone, Justin Berry and Green and Healthy Homes Initiative. I've been at the organization for a little over 3 years now. We're a nonprofit organization based here in Baltimore City that focuses on the link between housing conditions and health outcomes and social determinants of health. We started out as an organization focused on childhood-led hate poisoning, and that was about 30 years ago. I've done a lot of work around that. And now look at housing and the health impacts as holistically as we can. So dealing with triggers that would, or housing conditions that would trigger asthma, mold, moisture, things like that, and looking at energy efficiency And my role has been connecting that work to climate-friendly housing and building decarbonization space. So if there's state goals and new funding around moving from gas and fossil fuels to efficient electric appliances and renewables, so we can make sure that money is reaching local communities, both benefit their health and to improve the housing conditions more generally. So yeah, I'll start there and pass it to Mona.
I'm Valerie Root. I'm with the Baltimore Office of Sustainability. So we are part of the Department of Planning in the city of Baltimore. And what we do is we're there to serve as a resource, catalyst, and advocate for sustainable and resilient Baltimore. And how we define sustainability is meeting the environmental, social, and economic needs of Baltimore without compromising the ability of future generations to meet those needs. So a lot of our work really focuses around working with different sectors and communities to develop plans and then get them implemented. So some of those plans that we work on are the sustainability plan for the city, the climate action plan, our disaster preparedness plan, and others. We also, as I mentioned, really try to get the sustainability integrated into city government. So we do that in a number of ways, including, we have our sub-cabinet on sustainability and resilience. And a few things just trying to get those plans in action with the agencies, because as part of the Department of Planning, we're not often the ones who are actually doing that work. The other agencies, like some of our partners, agency representatives I see around here, are the ones who are really doing a lot of that work. So we're there to work with them and help advance those forward. So, we also really prioritize working with frontline communities to make sure that as we are developing those plans and implementing them, that those issues that people are most affected by things like climate change and resilience efforts are being directly benefited.
Get her on time too. Hi, I'm Doris. Today I'm also representing the Baltimore Climate and Resilience Group. We are struggling to also bring change to communities that are currently suffering under the lack of greenery, lack of tree canopy, health issues that are affecting the population. And so we want to do better. We want to engage with other people who want to assist us in learning about what are the problems, what are the issues that directly affect people who are living within those spaces. And what can we do for change? So we're here to represent those challenges to change, hoping that we can get all of your skills today to help us do that. We just frequently travel, as you heard Potatoes talk about visiting Amsterdam, which for us is like, wow, these people really get it. So we're also trying to learn to get it and to put that information out so that others can understand what is affecting them and shortening the lifespan.
Good afternoon. I'm Kim Trueheart. I served 26 years in the Navy. I came home and said, I can use everything I learned in the Navy to make a difference in my hometown. All you students, I hope you're gonna live here and you're gonna take all that you've learned to live here in my hometown, which needs help. We have struggled on many, many fronts. I operate the Liberty Village Project in Northwest Baltimore. It is a rec center that's 10,100 square feet of safe space for kids to come. I went there, opened the door this morning, and the kids were there to play basketball and do whatever other activities we had planned. But they need to know it's safe. They need to feel safe. And that's what I work to do every day. So the things that I'm learning through BSEC, I need help applying it in our safe space. And so all those who have been a part of it, who are willing to continue to work, come join me. Thank you.
Thank you to the panel for your introduction. The first question we want to ask is, what can a science project like BSEC do to support the implementation of equitable climate resilience projects? So we know that there are a lot of science-based projects that are out there, they're based in communities. And there's some form of, maybe some community science that's out there. But what are your thoughts on how these research projects can translate into action into these communities?
This summer was, a real good example of how kids learn about the environment around the rec center, to include the soil, the air, the temperature. Now, we need help turning that into something useful. Like, do the kids look at the weather monitor daily? Do they really understand what it's displaying? Can they articulate that to their fellow students, the ones that didn't meet you, the ones who hadn't worked with you? But we need to be able to communicate with each other, and they can share it amongst their peers. 5 of my kids were fortunate enough to go to a model UN conference this summer, which focused on environmental issues. They had participated in the BSEC program, so they had a knowledge of the lingo and what was going on. But that's not enough. They were grateful for having that knowledge before they went to the Dominican Republic. But it was so much for them just to get there. They had to get passports. Some of them flew for the first time. But I want them to go to the next level. I hope you help me. I'm gonna be asking for help, okay?
Where are we asking? But. So, you know, a science person, usually for young people, is the person that I'm gonna meet the 3rd period, the 4th period, or the 5th period. That's my science teacher, and they're gonna give me homework. They're gonna give me something to read, and I need to report out. But to have you physically in a neighborhood is a big plus. You're in my neighborhood, I'm looking at you, you are explaining to me your purpose for being there and the impact that it may have on me. It becomes personal to young people to have that face visible. The fact that you're willing to come to their territory. The fact that you are willing to come to what is often known as their hood. Your physical presence means more than it does in the classroom, the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th grade. In there, you're in charge and you're dominant, but just being in the community, you become friendly. I now understand your job. As you explain to me who you happen to be and your purpose for being there. So just an experience in soil collecting, which students did this summer, they have a greater respect for not only or who they happen to be, but your willingness to share and to explain what soil testing means and the impact of what's next for them if they learn the skill.
So I'm gonna take it in a slightly different direction. I would say that, in terms of looking at kind of making it actionable, it's really, working for government, we see a lot of great research come out, but we don't know how to apply it. So really, working with folks beforehand, whether it be government or communities, whoever it is you're working with, while you're developing research questions and things like that, so we can make sure that that end is in mind, while that information is being collected and so forth. Because, that's, a lot of times we look at things and we're saying, this is great, but how do I take this and turn it to that? Really, and looking at the fact that a lot of, especially resilience-related work, really requires behavior change, and that's peer-to-peer. So, really looking at how, thinking through how we can take that information and make it actionable. I think one great way is work with people up front. Work with whoever stakeholder you're looking at, whether that's government or looking for policy, you're looking to see how this might be applicable to policy. Or, if it's more around behavior change or adopting different practices that is talk to those members of the community and so forth. Because that's really a way to, kind of looking at the long game, because I've worked on research projects and I understand the process of putting together those proposals. So it's kind of, in a lot of ways, very separate from how you would make it actionable. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. You could still be developing your questions and getting your funding and so forth while collaborating and making it a long-term relationship. So that it doesn't just, you're not coming in, getting the research and then walking away. That's a huge thing that I've seen happen a lot bluntly, where, especially working with communities where there's been some research projects where they work with them, they're showing up at community meetings, they're getting all these surveys and getting all this data, and then they write their paper and walk away. And the people in the community just spend a lot of time and energy, and then they feel like next time someone comes around, they might not be as willing to share that time with them, because that's a resource. And so that always needs to be valued. So I would say, really in terms of that, looking at it as an ongoing relationship, especially.
Those are great, I'm glad I get to go after everyone else here to kind of have that context already set. I want to describe a bit about our organization's model, which I think will help kind of how we fit into the gaps here. So we do a lot. One of the big things we do in Baltimore City is direct service work, where we get grants from the city and the state and from philanthropy to go into homes to do work. So we do this to help serve the community because there's need and we want to help deliver these services. And our special thought with that is we try to bring together as many different funding sources as possible, especially by bringing in some of the kind of philanthropic dollars that can be more flexible to highlight our service delivery in a way that's innovative to make the case that this is how programs would potentially scale, and go to government and say, look at the success of doing it this way, which not everyone is able to do. Let's try to build towards being able to do this more consistently to serve people better. So we do this trying to work with community as much as possible, partially by having worked in Baltimore for over 30 years, also by trying to do deep community engagement, all that really important in the citizen partnership. So how the science that help fit into that is, one, we can only make the case to funders help fund new work if they have an appreciation for the challenges involved solved. So I think that that's a really important place where we see the impact of research highlighting some of these needs can help, because then the people who might fund it will understand that and be more interested in response to what we're saying. And I also think we try to work as we're doing innovative things to make sure that we're capturing the benefits that are being highlighted. And I had a really great conversation with our room upstairs, where one of the big things we talked about is like communities often know what the challenges are, what the needs are. And it's important to have data to back that up too. But I think I've seen how it's been really impactful when we can capture the positive benefits that are coming from things that are happening that are giving something to the community and build some momentum and excitement for that and make the case that we can build off of those. So I think that's a great opportunity to think about, where there's research that can help out.
The beauty about going last is that you're last. And so I would start with, when you enter into community, you want to be in action. Ask the question of, how am I an honor of community? That drives a much deeper context to move into action. Because what you'll start to understand is, how do we become more value-based rather than transactional-based? Because here's the shocking news: I've seen you before. You ain't nothing new. You just a new face speaking the same thing that somebody else spoke. You know, and sometimes there's trauma that's related to that. And so when you're a new face and going into the community, you think that, okay, let me go in, I'm doing the right thing. Your heart might be into it, but when you ask who you are in honor of community, you drop a parachute. You drop that whole mentality. You do more listening than you do talking. And by doing those things, by asking that question, you get deeper, richer data. And you start to build trust. Because eventually the grant will run out and you will leave, but you will want to come back and they will remember you. And the one thing is to be consistent. And with the language that I learned from my sister here, stand up, yeah, you. She taught me about the terminology mixed messaging. Because, thank you. I know you didn't expect that, so that's the cool part. Mixed messaging, because there's always a level of communication. Because often researchers speak a different language than what's spoken in community. And sometimes it does not translate. And most of the time, sometimes it's never explained in a way, because there's a deficit narrative that people believe in that is crap. And in order for you to enter into someone's neighborhood, you've got to go in with a clean slate. And your approach should be more humane and about humanity. Who cares about sympathy and empathy? Just be a human being. You're there to provide a solution. But also, when you provide that solution, understand the value that you bring when you lessen your footprint when you're ready to leave. So when you leave gracefully, with respect, and being an honored community, but also understand the value that you're leaving. So when you do come back, you're not starting from scratch.
I feel that this is a very deep and meaningful conversation. Certain points that you're really telling us, particularly those of us who are researching, right? So have you really dealt with, or can give us examples of some of these frustrations that you may have dealt with as researchers come in? And, you know, we're all trying to connect our research to things that are really actionable. So if you guys can give us some examples of that, and just give us an idea how we can improve upon the science that we're providing, and making sure that it's now actionable for different.
I'm gonna go in front of Kim, because Kim, she's gonna make a better statement, I'm just gonna. I think the one, factor that's always on the forefront. We always realize that we don't play well in the sandbox together, because your goals may not be my goals. But we look to have the same positive outcome that will benefit the masses, the people. It's not my ego, it should not be your ego. It should be about, what are we trying to fix? And so sometimes there are people at the table or in the sandbox who might have a different agenda. And I think it's on the other players to explain to them how it may not be fitting in at the time. So can we have a deeper conversation about what we really want, what you want, and how we can make that marriage? Because the overall goal is a solution to the problem.
Came back home in 2010. And some of you may know a gentleman by the name of Ron Daniels. I went to a Baltimore Development Corporation, which at the time was very controversial. They had their board meeting at 7:30 in the morning on a Thursday. They didn't expect to see any citizens at that board meeting. But I was there that morning that Ron Daniels, just leaving then, came to Maryland. The man was not even a US citizen at the time. But he talked about what Johns Hopkins was gonna do for Baltimore. And I didn't believe him, alright? And after the meeting, I walked up to him, shook his hand. I said, thank you, but stop experimenting on my babies. And I walked away. I said to his assistant, who he sent following me, that I'm gonna be watching. Because I think you have been experimenting on my community for years. And you need to stop. And he said, I'm gonna show you. So since 2010, he has shown an improvement, a dramatic improvement. I'm still not convinced because the systems are still in place to abuse us, to make fun of us. But I'm hopeful. The fact that some of you represent Johns Hopkins, my community is skeptical. But we're getting over that. And the way to ensure we get over that is you continue to come to us and work with us. Show us. And you know the $1 million grants that you get, you share those with us.
So I kind of spoke to this a little bit in my last question, but I just want to follow up on what you were saying, which is really looking at the co-benefits. You know, that is something really important in looking, is there's a lot of priorities out there for people, and you know, block by block, they can vary, household by household, they can vary. So, you know, there's a lot of things that are pressing. I mean, luckily we live in a city that has a high poverty rate, you know, there's a lot of inequities around the city, so even when people are looking at things like resilience and seeing that it's important, it might not be their top priority. So how you can couple those, you know, resilience standards with other co-benefits, and they're very easy to do in a lot of ways. I mean, they're so closely related to public health and just so many other things that are very important to people. So, you know, really making sure to communicate in that way. So you're not looking at it only as the science piece of it, but you know, how it actually affects people. And you know, one thing I just wanted to put in there, which is a little side note, but some folks I used to work with in Baltimore ecosystem study years ago are here. And I wanted to just give an example of something that one of the researchers there did, because I think it's just a good example. They were doing this research project on mosquitoes in different neighborhoods. And long story short, we're working with the community members, realized that, you know, people really care about trash in the neighborhood. And so when they're looking at our control site, not to see if we use different sites, you know, trash and vacant lots and things like that, like water, was that a better breeding, is that more of a breeding ground in other areas? So in addition to the citizen science, they actually took part of the funding and used it that neighborhoods involved in the project could use that fund, those apply for a grant for those funds to do community cleanups. So, you know, that was something that was really important to the community. So in addition to getting their research done and getting the, you know, getting some good engagement, they're also helping the community address some of their priorities. And when that can happen, you do have a lot of opportunity to really get that ongoing relationship and things like that, but also address some of those co-benefits.
The thing that came to mind for me was time and trust, and you hear people talking about this already a few places. But I think if you're working in a partnership and research is a part of it, understanding that you have to build the trust both with the people you're participating with, but also with your other partners on the project, and that can also take time. You know, Jonathan, right, is talking about, and others may as well, like, a lot of folks have been let down by commitments, whether from researchers or otherwise. And you as a researcher will probably have limited control over the ultimate outcomes related to your research, right? So understanding what types of partnerships you have and how to be transparent and clear about the commitments and the impacts that may be things that aren't things that you're doing, but will be in your partner's hands, I think is really important. So I work with the Hopkins students through the SOURCE program and such, where they come in for a year, they're learning about our work, and they're looking at the community, and there's a lot of moving pieces, and I think the thing I've come to appreciate in doing that a couple of times is encouraging from the beginning to take it slow, make sure they understand actually what our organization does and is able to deliver, how it impacts their work, and how they can be really clear in their communication with community members or the research side of what they're doing, to not get ahead of stuff that isn't something that is in their hands.
Okay, thank you. I would definitely say, be consistent. Be consistent in the way you speak, be consistent in the way you move in the room, be consistent in how you build relationships with people. Because as soon as you enter the room, you're being watched. They're watching every little thing that you do. And they just want to know, are you being phony for the grant, or are you a genuine person? And that plays back in trust. You know, and if you're an introvert, just tell people, hey, you know, I'm an introvert, and explain what an introvert is. And then people just gonna leave you alone. It's just really that simple. You know, be authentic. But also look to be relational. And also ask questions about the cultural context of the community. A great thing to ask is like, okay, how long have you been living here? How long have you seen the changes in the community? How does that make you feel? Just have a general conversation as if you care. They know you're gonna leave. You're not gonna be best friends. You're not gonna go to a Taylor Swift concert, nothing like that. That's not gonna happen. You know, so, but you can still be relational. And one example that we had was, which blew research, I work with School of Public Health, Dr. Megan Langshaw. Every year we develop white papers and students come to community online. And we had like two gentlemen and three women came in to interview people who measured clean air. We were doing a paper around clean air. The gentleman kept talking. You know, and they're talking in front of Black men. They kept talking. And the women that were there didn't say anything. And so the Black men said, okay, we need to stop because this is disrespectful. And they're, you know, everyone's like, okay, well, how is this disrespectful? They're just like, okay, a lot of us were raised by our mothers. You know, even though we may have a father involved, we were raised by our mothers. But when we listen to these men continually overspeak these women, it's considered disrespect. And so when you put yourself in, I'm parachuting in, and you lead with an ego, you will get slapped on the hand. And it's a lesson. And that's a lesson that they carried to, they told each and every student in that class, in that one harsh moment, that if we're going to speak as a team, not as individuals on the team, and we're going to have to set our ego aside in order to accomplish work.
It's something that you said, I want to put my name out that, it's so important to communicate with people clearly and in a way that people understand, because we offer a lot of jargon and acronyms and things like that. But I have seen in some cases, people take that to an extreme where they start talking down to community members almost and oversimplifying things. Understand that, they're intelligent people. They might not necessarily have the background and the knowledge of the terms you're using, explain it to them. But, make sure you're not talking to them like they're children, because that is something I've seen happen on a number of occasions.
And before we close on this subject, I would like to say that this is America, and we understand that there is a race and gender problem in America. We don't have to buy into it, but we should understand that we know that it does exist.
Thank you, for that response. My next question is, when we look into the future, when we think of the ideal scenario, when we think of BSEC, how we co-generate knowledge, and try and get the science and things that are actionable. What do you think is a successful, or how do you think that successful partnership should look between your organization, the communities we're working with, and with BSEC? This is whoever wants to hear
Success looks like we've identified a solution. We've identified a funding source and an implementation strategy together. Because often you'll come in and recommend something and leave us to our own devices to fund it. My name doesn't carry as much weight as Johns Hopkins, as Morgan, as Penn State. Can you imagine if I applied for a grant and had you as a partner? I'd increase my success rate tremendously. That I have a collaborative effort engaging you with my community. Do something like that. Don't just come in and leave. I don't need you. I really would like the partnership in earnest, in writing.
I think Kim identified the two important words in the room for us: togetherness and partnership. Communities cannot survive without you, and we understand that. You bring the goal to the table for us to get to the next step, and if you're going to be a part of the solution to remove the barriers for healthy communities, you must understand deep down in your soul how important you are. When we talk about the crucifixion, we understand it. So there are people who suffer each day from a different form of crucifixion, to be crucified within their own boundaries is unacceptable, especially when we have the knowledge to change the outcomes. So it is you that we rely on from your partnerships and your togetherness for change. With this one.
So looking at it from the perspective of where I work, I really love to see robust information and data out there that we can make very transparent and very understandable and relatable. So that people can look at it and say, this is the stuff that's studied, this is what I can do to make changes, so this is who I should be, I might be going to my city council person saying, this is important, this is what I'm speaking to. Something that really makes it so people can understand where they fit into it. Because, even looking at my own work, sometimes I look at things, I have trouble figuring out what I should actually do. You find these really great facts, but what do you do about it? So I think that's really that bridging that gap is really, how we can all work together to be able to put that out there for the public. So there's that information there, but there's also turning it into action.
A phrase my organization really likes is capacity building, and I think that's another way this can be really helpful, both for investing in communities, so community organizations, associations can go after grants and advocate for themselves and have those tools and gather information. And then speaking from the nonprofit side too, my nonprofit has a lot of capacity, and even in that context, I see how taking on things like research projects takes a lot of coordination and planning and time, and each time that happens, it's a new learning process, and that can be a challenge when everyone has their deadlines and all that, of course. But I think working with the partners so that you're building up their capacity so that the next time someone comes around, you're not having to start from square one with a research project or going after a grant, and understand that again takes time and takes partnership. But it's worth it for that long-term investment in strengthening the community and everyone working in it.
Start to move the ambiguity out of general terminology. Be specific. By being specific, you begin to manage expectations. So like say you go in, you bring a grant, you start at stage 1, stage 2, you go to collaboration, stage 3, it becomes a partnership, stage 4 is potential, becomes strategic partnership. Now you just tell people the only thing we can do stage 1 and stage 2. Community's gonna be like, okay, well, that's what it is. Okay, we're still gonna do it because of the value to it. And I think that when you start to look at community as value, it starts to take on has a different culture or texture to it. And so we always look at what is, as we lessen our footprint and we start to transition, how does it become a strategic asset for the long haul? Because eventually we're gonna go back to something. And the more, if we leave more than what we take, then we're not part of the extraction. And a lot of times you may be able to leave language and part of a process, but that also has value. But instead of just giving people the language, how do you use that language? And how does you make that language benefit you? And when you leave a process, how does this process become sustainable? And often when people go in and start it, they don't think about sustainability. So forget about the transaction, think about sustainability. Think about how can someone use this information to better their situation, because doing this work, we're all swimming upstream. I don't know how many people are going downstream like, this is easy. I had never heard that before in my life. We all swimming upstream. But if you can help me get a little bit further to ease the tension of swimming upstream against the current, well, I look at you like you're a valued part. Now we're moving into a different situation. Now we have a relationship. Because when you go back and say you're the reverse of what I'm talking about, they will boo you in a minute, and you ain't getting nobody's time. You can hold the me, you can have as many gift cards you want, you can figure out how many people, probably 2 people will show up. And they will boo you. And they will tell you Starbucks is in a different direction. You ain't welcome here. So be mindful, very mindful in how you approach, how you show up, how you're authentic, and just be consistent. And don't overpromise, and just tell people, this is what it is. We can only do one thing, and we're only gonna be here for 6 weeks. All right, cool. We're probably gonna come back next year. Okay, all right, great. manage people expectations the way you want your expectations managed.
And thank you for that. We wanna now talk about the co-generation of knowledge. We're entering into communities, but we're trying to do that in a way that is very meaningful. And we're trying to work with communities to generate that knowledge and that science together. And we're trying to do that across various groups and cities. So we want you to try and answer, how do we do that? How do we design that, our ability to really generate that knowledge together? Help us to ask the right research questions, and come out with the right outcomes that are expected. So how do we best do that? And if you have any examples of how that may have been done in the past, and you may want BSEC to do that now.
Um, I did a research project with the University of Maryland. And the project ended up, dealing with stresses that were traumatic, that families had to deal with. And the scientists on that developed their own data dictionary, but it really was not relatable in my community. They had defined some terms that I thought were offensive, that they felt they needed to propagate throughout this research. And something as simple as spirituality versus religion and how you approach it in the Black community could be offensive to some people. So we have to sit down and define the terms that we want to use. This was 6-7 years ago. And I told them that people's time was valued. They wanted families to come in after school. And it was the dinner hour for many of these families. True, they were the subject matter experts. They had the trauma in their families. They had to deal with it, but they also were living suspects. Okay, they had to feed the kids after school. They had to do homework after school. So I convinced Maryland that they had to build in a babysitter in the after-school program. Because we were meeting with these families from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. I said, if you want them parents in the meeting, somebody's gotta care for the kids. So pay for a babysitter. If you want the parents in the meeting, you gotta feed the kids. Because they're hungry. They brought dinner. You have to understand the things that you want to do may not be convenient to us. And those families are the subject matter experts. I don't care what you say or what degree you got behind your name. In many instances, they are the ones that you need to carry out your work and help them. Don't inconvenience them, help them.
Let me see if I can walk behind Miss Kim again. And stand up at her. For me, race is such an important item for the day. Only because I live in a community that's frequently disrespected and not looked upon as worthy. But your presence here today moves forward the hope that working together brings about change. If we don't get your knowledge and your energy, there will be no community improvement for us. And as Kim said, many times we are your subjects. And we understand that, and we've been your subject for 400 years. We would now like to engage with you as one human being to another, as one human being to another as we problem solve, as one human being to another as we experience the love and respect for each other. It has been a tough journey around grant writing, money that comes in that never uplifts the community, but supports the research only. So we're asking you to give major consideration to what we feel is fair practice. Fair practice for us means you will respect the answer that we give you. You'll be passionate about forgiving us if we made a mistake. You will do your best to educate us as we want to move forward and have greater understanding about what unification is needed to change the spaces we live in. If I am clear in understanding that where I live, I only have a 12% tree canopy, another community has a 40% tree canopy, sometimes I'm gonna wonder, was that by design? Did I miss something? Did someone fail to tell me the benefit of tree canopies? As I also look at the relationship to my disease-oriented population. Diseases that could be solved just with a tree. I'm in trouble.
Anybody else on it?
Actually kind of piggybacking on the two of you, which love the synergy, but, you know, looking at mutual interests and why you're all coming together on this, you know, respect that. If you were going on a date with somebody, you wouldn't come in and talk to them about what you're doing and not listen to them. You're look at it that way, you know, it's a relationship building. Also, you know, I know sometimes grants prohibit this, but as best you can, compensate people for their time. You know, even with making city plans, the most recent climate action plan, we actually went to a private foundation and secured funding, so we could make payments to people who attend community meetings, virtual or in person. You know, some people opted not to take it, but you know, you're be compensated $20 an hour. And you know, you're asking for people's time. That time is valuable, as they're saying, you know, making sure that they have their needs covered so they can participate and be there. You know, food, making sure you're on, if you're having a meeting, it's on the public transit lines, you know, things like that, there's parking available, you know, what kind of needs they have, making it easy for people to participate. Because they're actually giving you what you need, and I just hope that's the important to remember.
Quick things on code generation, I think, learned things I wish I had done better or did okay, and we still want to do better. Learning the history, these are conversations that have often happened before, there's history in the place, and learning that before you go in, I think is worth the time. Also recognizing you're not gonna be able to learn everything, and so going in with the humility, that you will get some things wrong. And the folks will know more about stuff than you in many cases, and will probably take some missteps and be prepared for them.
I would definitely answer the question authentically, why am I here? Flat out. I understand like people talked about time, one thing that we've done was to give people a different label. Instead of calling them participant, we call them data creators. And we started to assess a value to data creator. So that way we can see them a little bit differently. So that there's a different higher level of respect, and respecting a lot of the subject matter expertise that are brought to the table. And definitely, if you do things at night, without a doubt, feed people, take care of their babies. You know, it's so easy. You can put that into a grant. Some grants will allow, some grants won't, but you just have to. And that's just part of it. It's showing respect for the relationship they have with their family, and it's showing respect for their time. You know, and Rowdy Orbit we're a for-profit company. You know, but we've learned to adopt more nonprofit values. So we don't look at people as units, we look at people as people as units, people as people. And it's vitally important. And so I think that if you remain humble and a human being and treat people in that way, you should be fine and allow that you're going to make mistakes. It's gonna happen. You're gonna get beat up at some of these meetings. It's gonna happen. But trust me, it will toughen you up. There's language that you will hear, that you've heard before. And it will help you fine tune your approach when you're talking to people that don't look like you and may not have the same social economic background as yourself.
I don't, we have time for another question.
For them to go forward, it's full.
Okay. I'll just close with this. As a researcher, and then all of our researchers here, I think we are taking this as a pep talk, and we're energized, and we want to be great at this, not just for the sake of writing papers, but for the sake of the city. Because we're also part of the city, we're also part of the community. Our students live here, our faculty live here. So we're going to take this and be energized and do a lot more as we go into next year. And we'll have more engagement with community as we go into this particular year. So very quickly, give our panel a round of applause. Good evening.